Greetings once again, it's Pastor Lorfield. Today we're going to look at John chapter 6. Uh, each week or so, we try to gather together via our technology and take a look at Scripture, diving in. I'm always learning things as I do this, and I hope you do as well. So that's the introduction. Here is the Bible study. John chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. Today we're going to go with verses 1 all the way through 15. And we're going to stop right there at verse 15 because that's where Jesus then walks on water. John chapter 6, as I mentioned, is a long chapter. So we're going to break this up in parts, but we're going to take this account first. And I want to be very clear, this is an account. John was a witness to this, along with, we're going to find out, 5,000 men, as well as women and children. What this means is if John is telling a lie, he's making quite a big claim that Jesus did something that more than 5,000 people witnessed, who would suddenly all have to have this recollection, because there were likely those that were alive when John wrote this, that also were alive when Jesus did this miracle, likely some of the younger folks that were there. So I really want to stress to you that even though this sounds like just an amazing miracle, which it is, it's a miracle, it is also true. So let's jump right in. Verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. After this. All right, after this, remember we were previously in John chapter 5, where Jesus healed a lame man outside of the city of Jerusalem at a place in a pool called Bethesda. Now, that was sometime before this. We don't know. John doesn't necessarily write in strict chronological order. He'll give you one event and then he'll say, and then this happened later. Here's a great example. I'll tell you about the trip that I went on in the year of 1988 with my family. We went on this big, massive trip. We left Wisconsin and we went down to California, and we also saw Yellowstone and Glacier National Park. We saw the redwoods. We didn't actually go to the Grand Canyon. We ended up going to Mesa Verde in Colorado, which was really cool too. All right. So what did I just do there? All right. I didn't give you a chronological listing of our itinerary. I gave you kind of the highlights as they popped into my head. California, that's obviously was kind of the big part of it, going there because, well, there's Disneyland, but also we had family out in California and went and visited them as well. So for me, that was kind of the reason for the trip. And then other things like going and seeing Yellowstone, which that was probably the next like coolest thing. That one came to mind, but that came actually after Glacier National Park, which I mentioned, which all of that stuff came after we were in Colorado for Mesa Verde. That was actually the first of the things that I mentioned. That was the first thing that we did. We did lots of other stuff. You can imagine such a long road trip with a almost 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. I'm not sure what my parents were thinking, but it still is memorable to this day. Anyways, John tells his gospel kind of in a similar way. He'll tell you one event and he'll tell you another event. Sometimes he'll use the words like after. Sometimes he'll give you a specific amount of days, like on the third day, or something like that, or 8 days later, or on the 8th day. Then we have a little bit more tight chronological line, but other times it's left a lot more open. And we can tell this because if you look at a map, Jerusalem is down here. Siloam, this is another pool that's in Jerusalem. My map, for some reason, has a bunch of different sites around Jerusalem marked, but it doesn't have the city of Jerusalem marked on here for whatever reason. But anyways, the Sea of Galilee is way up here. That's about 80, 90 miles away. Um, and let's zoom into where Jesus goes. So Jesus goes from Jerusalem here, and he walks probably along this road through Gerizim, then probably along the Jordan River here, and along the Sea of Galilee. And as he's going, he's probably doing other miracles as well. We know that he healed the lame man at Bethesda, but then he also probably healed along the way, preached along the way, and now he's got a crowd of 5,000 by the time he reaches this area way up in the northern, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So let's, oh, yeah. I had a map queued up for this, but sometimes well, here we go. Jesus feeds the 5,000. So here's basically a little map of John chapter 6. This is the traditional location of the feeding of the 5,000. There is a couple other locations. Some think it was on this eastern side of the Sea of Galilee by Gergesa, because there's a significant mountain there. And when we say mountain, we're not talking like Rocky Mountains here. We're talking a hill that rises up pretty quickly, but one that does so, anywhere from like 500 to 2,000 feet in elevation from base to top. So we're not talking anything huge. We're just talking, a significant geological feature that rises out of the ground, but really enough that a crowd of 5,000 people could actually continue following Jesus. Anyways, this is the traditional location of the feeding of the 5,000, where this little flag right here is. There's a church that's there, the church of the feeding, where there's a nice mosaic tile that has 2 fish and 5 loaves, and we're going to see that that's part of this story. That dates back, I believe, to about the 400s or so. At least its identification leads back to that 4th century time. Anyhow, so that's the setting. The first verse gives us the setting. And I'm going to pause right here because I've got a phone call. All right, I'm back. And as I was saying, Jesus likely would have been gathering this crowd. This crowd would have been gathering as he did that miracle, as he went along the road. So now let's take a look at verse 3 and continue on from there. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. All right. One of the things that rabbis did is that they sat down when they taught. They would sit down. They'd teach and preach for a long time, often for hours on end. Peter, famously in the book of Acts, preaches into the night, so much that they're all up in the 3rd floor of this building, and this young man, this young boy, Eutychus, falls asleep, and he's sitting in the window, and he falls out and dies. And that's I always tell my confirmation students, that's why you don't fall asleep in church. But the good news with Eutychus is that Peter raised Eutychus from the dead. But yeah, they sat down when they preached, when they taught, and the disciples were here, the main audience. It wasn't necessarily the crowds. Jesus sat down with his disciples. John also tells us that the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And again, remember, we're dealing with a chronology that leaves things kind of loose. But John does center this around the Passover, and he does so not only for kind of chronological reasons. We had the Passover earlier in chapter 2, but now we have it also here. But I think John wants us to be thinking in terms of the next time it's going to be Passover, which is when Jesus is going to be betrayed. On the night before, he's going to have that Passover meal. He's going to institute the Lord's Supper. But the one thing that's really unique about John's Gospel is that you don't have Jesus um, doing the Last Supper. You have him having a meal, but you don't have him saying the words of institution. You have him instead washing feet and talking about loving one another, and that the least is, or that the greatest among you must be least, and so forth. So John's Gospel, I think, already is operating with the assumption that you kind of know the story of Jesus, especially including the important stuff like baptism and the Lord's Supper. You kind of know about that. And John wants to give you kind of another angle to look at this from. So um, that's, I think, the reason why we have the Passover, the Feast of the Jews, was at hand. Jesus lifts up his eyes and sees that this large crowd was coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Here's an interesting thing that comes up. This little word "where," we would probably not recognize it in English. But this word "pothen" in the Greek, in John's Gospel, it serves as a very important word because it's kind of one of these flag words. When it shows up, it gives us, it's not just asking, Jesus isn't just asking Philip directions. Philip, of course, was probably the local, or at least one of the locals. I mean, Philip, Peter, James, John, they were all from this area. But when Jesus is asking where or from whence, it's really a question that has a deeper meaning, really kind of asking, where do we get all of this from? It's a Christological question. It's a question that he's trying to lead Philip into trusting him as God, as provider, as the good shepherd that's going to feed the flock. And we see this in verse 6. He said this to test him, for he himself knew that what he would do. That gives us an idea that Jesus is not asking for, who are the local bread purveyors. But Philip doesn't quite catch it. Philip answers him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. 200 denarii, that's 200 days' salary. So think of what you'd make 2/3 of your annual salary, or basically whatever you make after taxes. That Philip is saying that wouldn't be enough to feed these 5,000 people. That just shows you how much bread costs. So one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, verse 8 here, said to him, verse 9, there is a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? Again, here is where the Greek really kind of fills in some nice color for us. Each of these words, boy, barley loaves, 2 fish, each of these words have a diminutive addition to it. We don't really have that in English. You kind of do in Spanish. You have like poquito, or some other that ito end with Spanish. In Greek, you have this too. You have a way of diminishing something. And so really the sense here is that this young boy servant has 5 barley loaves. Now, again, barley loaves are barley was not a food for, it's not what you'd set out for your guests. It's what you use to feed animals, and whatever was left over, then you'd make bread with it, because it doesn't have a high gluten content. It's really dense. It is healthy as far as, or it's nutritious. It's got, nutrient dense, but at the same time, it's not going to have that nice, wonderful texture that bread will have that's made from wheat. Another thing that's really kind of it needs to be mentioned here, the word for bread in Greek it always means wheat bread, unless, as is in the case here, um, it's modified. It's modified by the word that says, bread of barley. In other words. All right, and then two fish. And here again, we have um, form of the word for fish, meaning the translation would be better. That was two dried fish. So this isn't fresh fish. This isn't like a delicacy. This is dried, salted, fish jerky. Um, so the point is here is you have an inadequate gift giver who has inadequate gifts, not only in number but in quality. So the question that Andrew then says, but what are they, or what is it for so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. All right, here Jesus is already saying something significant. Have the people sit down, have the people recline. The verb here is a word that is used for reclining at table. John Chrysostom, he was a preacher in the I'm doing this off of memory. I believe in the 400s in um, in the Byzantine Empire. He was well known. He was in um, Constantinople. I was trying to think of the name, what Istanbul used to be. And I should remember the name of the song. Istanbul was once Constantinople. Well, Chrysostom was in Constantinople preaching. He preached often to the emperor, and not in a pleasant way. He always derided the emperor and his empress for their fine and fancy living, and that wasn't befitting a Christian. But in preaching on this, Chrysostom notes that Jesus bade them at once to recline as though the table were prepared and ready. So the word here is something that is used more than just the action of sitting down, but come, sit, everything's ready, which following Andrew's comment, what is it for so many people, really gets your head scratching. Now there was much grass in this place. This is probably my favorite sentence in John's Gospel. It seems of all the things you could mention that there's grass here. Why does John do that? Well, remember here, we have a crowd, we have a shepherd who lays his flock down in green pastures. Do you see what's happening? John is identifying Jesus here with the good shepherd of Psalm 23. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Again, this should be repeated. This is probably something you might have already known, but this is counting only the men. This is a very clear case. Sometimes in Greek, where we have where we talk about man, it's talking about men and women. But in this case, it is specifically that there were 5,000 men, but that we also know that there was a crowd that also had women and children as well. So there would have been more than 5,000 there. Then we see verse 11. This I think we ought to take our time with. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave. Wait, I almost got ahead of myself. When he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish as much as they wanted. That was actually an intentional slip, because this verse sounds a whole lot like on the night that he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Well, that's not in John's gospel. Of all the gospels, that one, it's not in John's gospel, but John has this, and he uses the same language as the words of institution, or at least the initial actions, the taking the loaves, when he had given thanks. The word there is that he made Eucharist, Eucharisto, and then he gave it. He distributed it to those who were seated. So also the fish as much as they wanted. And and now we are distributing from this meager portion to all. And when we find out, verse 12, and when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. All right, so we have Jesus giving us kind of a foreshadowing of the Lord's Supper, where he gives thanks and takes bread, gives thanks, then he gives up the people food to eat, food which fills them up, and there is more. Um, and then Jesus tells the disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost, or that nothing may perish. Um, this also brings to mind John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have eternal life. That same language is used. That phrase only gets used there and in a couple other places. Um, so we have here some connections that are being woven through John's text that are getting us to think that more is going on than just people eating here. That this has connections to the 23rd Psalm, that this has connections to the Lord's Supper, that this has connections to John 3:16, that great promise that no one would perish, but that they would have eternal life. Um, so that's all that's going on there. There's a lot in there. And I say weaving through because I really think the way John does his Gospels, he takes this this wonderful literary work. John's Greek is simple. It's so simple that I can read it. I'm not a great Greek scholar by any means. I got almost all the stuff I tell you, I'm getting from commentaries and from uh, lexicons and from sources written by people who are far smarter than me. But I can kind of muddle my way through John's gospel. It's very simple language, um, but it's also brilliant. It's not crude. It's woven very carefully. He uses very careful word choices, and when he does, it's always one of those things where you just pick it up. Or if you're like me, you have someone else that's really smart point it out to you, and then you could go, "Oh yeah, I didn't notice that before." Um, Verse 13, so they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is coming into the world. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. All right. So John, as I've said before, has as the first part of his gospel as a book of series of signs, the wedding of Cana, the raising or the healing of the man's son, the official son, the healing at Bethesda, and now here also the feeding of the 5,000. The greatest sign, of course, is the resurrection of Christ himself. That's the eighth and final sign of the book of John. Uh, now, the people recognize that something amazing has happened, but they see Jesus as a prophet who is coming into the world. Now, what are they talking about? This indeed is the prophet that is coming into the world. Well, there were some in John chapter 1 who were asking John the Baptizer, who are you? And John confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ. And they asked him, what then? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? What do they mean by the prophet? Well, you have to go back here then to Deuteronomy 18. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. it is to him you shall listen. And again in verse 18 here, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. That is talking about Jesus. But the people of Israel weren't thinking of that being the Messiah. They didn't have their biblical theology all kind of filled out, but um, they were asking some of the right questions nonetheless. This indeed is the prophet who is coming in, who has come into the world. Again, this phrase here, this "come into the world," um, that's that Christological phrasing um, that is really important. Um, that we talked about with those that are asking John the Baptizer, are you the Christ? Um, but then Jesus sees that they want to make him king by force, and Jesus, this is a very important thing. Jesus doesn't come to be king like the other kings come. He doesn't come conquering with armies, at least not the kingdoms of this world. So what he does is he does what he did in the beginning. He withdraws into the mountains by himself, and he prays there. So Jesus here takes a step back from the crowd. We're going to find out what happens to the crowd next time, but they want to make him king. They're all excited about this Jesus, and how could things go wrong? How could Jesus end up at the cross alone? Well, John 6 ends up being the turning point in this first part of the Gospel of John, where people go from being excited about the ministry of Jesus to it starting to be a problem for others. So I'll encourage you, tune in next time. We're going to talk about Jesus walking on the water, and we'll dive into at least the beginning of the bread of life discourse. As you can see, there are 71 verses in John's Gospel, and if I'm going to go verses 16 through 71, that's going to be a long Bible study. So we're going to probably take this in a few chunks. I'm probably going to break it up in really small chunks, actually, so that we can take the time we need on this chapter, this really important chapter of the Bible. One last thing I want to do before I depart. I'm not departing. I just want to highlight there's some really good artwork that's out there on this, and I just want to kind of show you. This is just a simple Google search for up here, the feeding of the 5,000 in artwork. Uh, this is a painting I've mentioned before from Tissot or Tissot. I don't know how his name is pronounced, but I just love this. You have the 5,000 all being seated. We find out in Matthew's gospel that it's in groups of 50, and Jesus here up at the top, but they're all being fed, they're all being cared for, and they're receiving just enough food, and we see the disciples with the baskets distributing it all. It's just a wonderful painting, but I think there's always something you can learn from these paintings. Another painting that I just find this, I just like this. This is just a simple. I don't know who has done this one, but there's some really interesting ones. Now this one, I believe this is done by a Japanese. Was it a Japanese or was it a Hmong or an Indian artist? But it's just a here. One of the things that's been in a lot of discussion lately is about Jesus wasn't a white European. Well, that's fine, and he wasn't. No one is saying he is. He also probably wasn't an Indian either. but he's kind of dressed in Indian garb here. One of the amazing things that cultures have done throughout history is to put Jesus into their own kind of cultural context. I mean, there's some where you see Jesus looking like, um, uh, kind of an African. Others where he looks Japanese. Other where he looks Chinese. And yes, where he got the blonde hair, blue eyed Jesus. Um, this isn't necessarily some kind of supremacy. It's more saying that this Jesus is my Jesus. He's the Jesus that's for me. And that's quite all right. Um, I think it's important, though, also to remember that Jesus indeed was true man, born specifically, you know, of the lineage of David, of Mary, lived in Israel, lived in Judea and Galilee, and he had all the different features that someone of his, a Jewish man of his day and age, would have had. What that is, I honestly can't tell you. I don't really know what Jesus looked like, but I like these various um, paintings that give us a little bit of insight here as to um, what an artist took away from the feeding of the 5,000. This one's just one that I love. This one, just Jesus breaking bread, and you see this mass of people. Anyhow, there's lots to explore, and I encourage you take a look, do a Google search on the artwork of the feeding of the 5,000. You're going to be pleasantly surprised that there's lots of really amazing images that come up. Lots of great artwork that's done, um, and each of them kind of has something to say um, as you take a look and as you study it. Oh, here's a great one. This one's "Feeding of the 5,000" by John Riley. I like this one. Um, I kind of like some of the modern artwork too. I think it's great. Um, so I'll leave that with you, and I will see you again soon. And um, until we do see each other, the Lord bless and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you his peace. Amen.